Today I've been asked to talk about blood sugar, more specifically, blood sugar control. And as it's 2020, I just happen to have access to the American National Diabetes Statistics Report, which came out earlier this year, and it portrays a fairly gloomy picture of the situation in North America. And that doesn't bode very well for us Europeans either, because we tend to follow America when it comes to all things diet related. So what's the situation over in the US of A? Not very good. 1 in 10 adult Americans is currently diagnosed with diabetes, and that's type 2 or non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. Alarming enough, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, because a further 1 in 3 have been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. You can think of that as the preclinical precursor to type 2 diabetes. And once you've been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, most people, unless they really change their lifestyles, within 5 to 8 years will progress to clinical diabetes with all of the risks attendant. The iceberg is larger than that, because both diabetes and metabolic syndrome are underdiagnosed. In fact, they're hugely underdiagnosed. So I think it's quite possible that where I said 1 in 10 Americans are diagnosed with diabetes, it may well be that 12, 13, or even 14 adult Americans now have this. And where it says 1 in 3 diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, it may be as much as 1 in 2. Who knows? I don't think anybody really knows. We have clues which come from a couple of other areas. If you have metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes, you will typically have other kinds of problems, including non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, and the figures for that appear to be about 1 in 4 at the moment, and you will very commonly have hypertension. Other problems as well, such as problems with plasma lipid profile, but according to the CDC data from last year, 1 in 2 American adults now have clinical hypertension, an astonishing figure. And then if you add in the people who have preclinical hypertension, just a little bit below the hypertension cutoff, but they are moving in that direction, you have to throw in a lot more people besides. You have to set this in a context of a culture where 89% of the population is now overweight, and at least 38% of them are physically inactive. And that's important because being overweight and being physically inactive are significant risk factors for developing metabolic syndrome and clinical diabetes. And I'll go into the details of that in the next few slides. If it was just a problem with blood sugar, we wouldn't have to worry too much about it. But the real problem is that having either diabetes or, to a lesser extent, metabolic syndrome increases the risk of a number of subsequent pathologies, including heart disease and stroke. Along with stroke come the dementias, both vascular dementia and Alzheimer's. Kidney and liver disease, the risk of both of those conditions is increased, as is the risk of cancer. A lot of different diseases under that heading, and I'm thinking particularly of the gastrointestinal tract cancers, but there's 1 or 2 others besides. And then we can throw in blindness, nerve damage, impotence, and a range of other side effects or long-term sequelae to diabetes. And now you can begin to see, I think, why a diagnosis of diabetes increases the risk of early death. Now, we all know about the so-called deaths of despair caused by drug addiction, overdoses, things like that. But diabetic complications are another major contributing factor to the fact that life expectancy has been falling for 4 years in the United States, the last 3 years in the United Kingdom, and is starting to show downturns in vulnerable or bellwether groups in many other countries. Once you start moving into diabetes, a lot of different things are going wrong. Fatty infiltration of the muscle, intoxication of mitochondria, changes in the beta cells in the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. For example, you're losing increasing numbers of those beta cells, and not only is insulin changing, but so is the less well-known hormone amylin. Some of the gut hormones are shifting around as well, the ones which are involved in satiety. So there are many, many problems that are developing. This very complex machinery is breaking down in many, many places. But we can simplify this, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to talk about 3 compartments, if you will, in the body: the gastrointestinal tract, the blood system, and skeletal muscle. Now, skeletal muscle is important because I know people think that when insulin kicks in, glucose is cleared from the blood and stored as glycogen in liver. That's true, but the storage capacity of liver is quite small. Muscle is a much more important sink. Now that system works pretty well if you're living in the way that evolution designed us to live, as a hunter-gatherer. Now there are hunter-gatherer cultures which still exist, and if we look at a population like this, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, problems with blood sugar control don't exist. And the reason for that is they have very well developed skeletal muscle. They're constantly on the move. They take high levels of physical exercise, constant physical activity, which means that the skeletal muscle has a high count of mitochondria. Those are the organelles within the cell where fuels such as sugar are burnt, oxidized, and transferred into ATP, which is the energy molecule for all of our cells. And because the mitochondria are very active and the muscle is fit, it is expressing on its surface these glucose uptake receptors called GLUT4. That is what healthy, exercised muscle looks like. The hunter-gatherers aren't eating much sugar. There's not much starch in their diet either, so the amount of sugar entering the gastrointestinal tract is pretty small. Moves into the blood, and there you've got all of these glucose uptake systems, the GLUT4, which takes that glucose, brings it into the muscle where it is consumed in the mitochondria. Very little sugar is left in the blood, just enough to be able to continue to function. This is not a blueprint for diabetes. But if you wander around America, you don't see many hunter-gatherers left. What you see are people like this. These are gamers. They don't get much physical activity. So when you look at their skeletal muscle, what you see is a reduced activity, reduced levels of mitochondria, reduced expression of these GLUT4 receptors. This is under-exercised muscle. But they have another problem as well. And the other problem is that they're eating huge amounts of sugar. This data only goes up to 2005, and what it shows is an increase in the average intake of sugar in 1820 of about 4 pounds per year, per person. And you can see that by the year 2000, that has increased to about 115 pounds. Now, the sugar industry would have you believe that since that time, levels of sugar intake have declined, but it looks to me as if they've massaged their data, and in reality, levels of sugar have probably increased slightly or possibly plateaued. I don't see any convincing evidence that that is getting better. So what is happening is we're pouring vast amounts of sugar into our systems, into the gut. Not just sugar. We're eating far more starch. This is a typical hunter-gatherer diet. You can see a lot of it is fats and proteins, not much starch there at all. That's a hunter-gatherer type of diet. What do we eat now? We eat junk, ultra-processed foods with huge amounts of carbohydrates as well as the sugar. You can see in the Coca-Cola in the cup at the back there. Lots of flour, lots of potato products, lots of carbohydrates, which once you eat them, they're digested, they're broken down in the small intestine into more sugar. So let's go back to those gamers. Their skeletal muscle is dysfunctional and they're pouring enormous amounts of sugar into the gut, which is absorbed into the blood, and you don't really have enough uptake of that sugar into the muscle because the muscle just isn't very active, and so it accumulates in the blood. And as we get older, other pathologies might kick in. We become less mobile, less physically active, and so the activity and the functionality of muscle declines even further. And if you're still eating this Western ultra-processed diet, the sugar continues to build up in the blood, and now there's hyperinsulinemia, hyperglycemia, and chronic inflammation, structural changes to enzymes, cellular receptors. This is a system that is going wrong in many, many different kinds of ways. So what should we do? We should definitely take more exercise. Relatively easy to do if you're living in Europe, where the cities are still largely fairly pedestrian friendly. Not so easy to do if you live in America, where the cities tend to be built around cars and they're very spread out. It's actually rather difficult to walk the streets in Texas, in California, in Florida. But exercise is certainly a good thing, because when that happens, you're starting to recreate decent functionality in the skeletal muscles. The numbers of mitochondria increase. mitochondrial neogenesis, new ones form. The GLUT4 receptors, the glucose uptake pumps, increase on the surface of the muscle, and more of the glucose that is in the blood is taken up into the muscle, and if at the same time you reduce your intake of sugars and starches and go into something that's more like a ketogenic diet, then levels of sugar, glucose in the blood will continue to fall. And if you were diabetic, you will move back to metabolic syndrome, and you will then move back to normality. You can cure yourself. And we know this because this has been shown repeatedly in the last few years by Mike Lean. He has shown that weight loss, calorie restriction, is enough in many cases to reverse type 2 diabetes. And he wasn't the first to show this by any means. William Noller showed the same thing in 2002, a combination of weight loss and exercise. And the Australian academic Karen O'Day did the same thing in 1980. And other people have also showed this same kind of pattern. Interestingly, William Noller's group showed that a program of weight loss and exercise was twice as effective than taking anti-glycemic drugs. And of course, it's a whole lot safer, and of course, brings along with it a whole range of other health benefits. Now, there's another paper here that is not quite as well known by Richard Feynman's group, and what he was able to demonstrate that carbohydrate restriction on its own is really, really helpful. It reduces high blood glucose, as you can see here, does not require weight loss and leads to the reduction or elimination of medication. So a ketogenic diet in itself is a good thing to adopt. When it comes to weight loss, if you're trying to do it that way alone, as a rule of thumb, a weight loss of about up to 10% of your body weight seems to be what is required to trigger these types of improvements. So if you're 200 pounds, you need to lose 20 pounds. If you're 300 pounds, you need to lose 30. And again, none of this is new either, because the French doctor Apollinaire Bouchardin in 1870 published a report saying severe calorie restriction is enough to reverse diabetes. This was not exactly a clinical trial. This was the siege of Paris. The city was besieged. No food was coming in. There were, people were hungry, people were starving. But what he found was his diabetic patients miraculously cured. They no longer had type 2 diabetes. And that's a historical element that I think is important, because type 2 diabetes is a relatively new disease. And one of my specialities is the study of mid-Victorian England, the period between 1850 and 1900. And we know that in that population, which had a life expectancy very similar to our own, type 2 diabetes was actually vanishingly rare. The same was true in North America. The great American physician William Osler in 1892 reported that in the patients who had been through Johns Hopkins that year, 35,000 patients, a mere 10 of them had type 2 diabetes. And if you look at the textbooks of the time, you will find that in the chapters on diabetes, 90% of the text is about type 1. There was a little, a small section on type 2, but it was a fairly small section because there just weren't very many of those types of patients. So to come back to the machinery, because now we can start to think about additional factors we can add to this kind of weight loss, calorie restriction, carbohydrate restriction kind of input, which is a very good place to start. Over there on the top left, you can see the molecule of insulin binding to insulin receptors in the cell membrane. That's that bilayer across the top third of the slide, which, as you know, is a lipid bilayer. And then over on the right, you have the glucose uptake receptors. And once the insulin has bound to the receptor, you have an enzyme of called tyrosine kinase, which is activated, leading to very, very complicated sequence of events, which eventually results in the expression of more of these GLUT4 receptors. Now, that membrane that the insulin receptor is embedded in is a lipid membrane, and it has been shown that by taking omega-3s, you can improve insulin sensitivity in metabolic syndrome, possibly in clinical diabetes as well. And it is thought that the way in which that is working is that as the omega-3s are built into the cell membrane, they actually change the environment that the insulin receptor is built into and change the structure of the insulin receptor itself, making it more sensitive to insulin. So this is something you can add to your weight loss, calorie restriction, exercise program. And then going back to that machinery, it is very complicated. We know cofactors are needed to support the chain of events that goes from the insulin receptor to the glucose uptake, and they include chromium, zinc, anti-inflammatory agents in general, and possibly vitamin D playing a role in there as well. And of course, these are some of the areas which we specialize in. So I think that it would be rash to say make diabetes history, but what we can say is that in order to improve blood glucose control in general, diet, exercise, and there's a great deal more that can be added to this to improve people's blood glucose control, their health expectancy, and their life expectancy.